more people have more ideas lead to more inventions and innovations, more inventions and innovations lead to productivity gains, and more productivity gains lead to higher standards of living.
Look, we're in for a real treat tonight. We're here to see and hear from Marian Tupy, the Centre for Independent Studies Max Hartwell Scholar-in-Residence for 2026. Marian Tupy is the editor and founder of humanprogress.org and a senior fellow at the Centre for Global Liberty and Prosperity at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Marian specialises in globalisation, global wellbeing, and he's the co-author of the 2022 book, Superabundance. Tonight, he's presenting what in many ways is a rather simple notion in the statistical terms of abundance and how of human progress and how the past 200 years, the last have been a period of unrivaled, unprecedented human progress and material prosperity, particularly in Western societies. And Marian's going to go through explaining that, and then it can very easily move into some quite mind-expanding notions of human progress, which I'm really looking forward to getting into. Please, can you welcome to the stage to hear about human progress and superabundance, Marian Tupy.
So I'll take about a half an hour or so to talk about resources and population, and especially about the human ability to expand resources into infinity. The word infinity will actually play a role in my talk. The basic premise of my talk is that more people have more ideas. More ideas lead to more inventions and innovations. More inventions and innovations lead to productivity gains, and more productivity gains lead to higher standards of living. The views that I'm going to be presenting to you may be counterintuitive. They are certainly controversial out there amongst the public, but they are not some sort of a homespun theory. My thesis has been promulgated by people such as the Nobel Prize-winning economists, including Paul Romer, Michael Kramer, Robert Lucas, all of whom argued against the prevailing Malthusian view of the world. The Malthusian view is based on the work of the English preacher and scholar Thomas Malthus, who claimed to have shown mathematically in a 1798 essay on the principle of population that resources grow only at a linear rate, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., whereas population grows at an exponential rate, 1, 2, 4, 16, 32, and he believed that the gap between the two rates must eventually lead to overconsumption of resources and scarcity and eventually famine and the destruction, collapse of Christendom. Malthus's concerns reached fever pitch in the second half of the 20th century when the population of the world started to massively increase with the spread of better science and better medicine, especially in Asia. That was especially where this man comes into the picture, Paul Ehrlich, a Stanford biologist, just turned 94. And Paul Ehrlich went to India, saw a lot of people, and that made him very depressed. And so he wrote a book, The Population Bomb, which sold millions of copies, was translated into countless languages, and the book opens with the following warning: the battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. Well, it's 2026, and instead of starvations and famines, we have a record decline in famines around the world. Actually, just as Ehrlich was writing his book, The Population Bomb, basically famines have pretty much stopped outside of war zones. Today, famines still happen. They are man-made. They usually happen in regions where people are killing each other, but they are not a result of some sort of inability of the earth to produce enough food. As you can see, we had a massive decrease in famine deaths beginning in the 1970s all the way to the present. So in superabundance, we attempt to quantify the growing abundance of resources. Again, famines have decreased. We have ever more people. That tells us that resources are less of a problem than we assumed. And in our book, we try to quantify this by looking at prices. If a price of a commodity goes up, that tells us commodity is getting scarce. So if the price of a commodity goes down, it tells us it is becoming more abundant. And of course, the free market, you can think of the free market as a giant computer, which allows us to gauge the desires and expectations of 8 billion people. Every time a person buys a cup of coffee, the price goes a little bit up. Every time a person doesn't buy a cup of coffee, the price of coffee goes down. Again, the market, the global marketplace gives us prices that we can then infer from. But which prices to use? There are a lot of prices about. You're all familiar with nominal price. That's the one that you see in a shop when you go to buy butter or gas, or in your case, petrol, I guess. That's the nominal price at the moment of purchase. But of course, if you are looking at prices over long periods of time, you need to account for inflation. Every Aussie knows that. This is a picture from 1922 Germany, where hyperinflation meant that burning of Reichsmarks instead of wood was actually cheaper. So we know that that you need to adjust for inflation. But there is a problem with both of these prices, and that is they don't tell you what is happening in your wallet. So very often you will have maybe an elderly member of the family who will say things like, "Oh, when I was a young man or a young woman, a liter of petrol in Australia cost this much. Now it costs that much." But of course, people were also making much less money. And this is where time prices enter the picture. So whereas nominal prices are denominated in dollars and cents, time prices are measured in hours and minutes of work. Simply put, time price tells you how long you have to work in order to buy something. If today your wage is, let's say, 30 Aussie dollars an hour and a kilo of beef costs $30, then the price of beef is 1 hour of labor. If in 20 or 30 years' time you are making $60 an hour and the price of beef is still $30, then you're only working half an hour. Okay, so time prices tell you how long you have to work in order to buy something. I'm just going to give you one quick example. So in 1973, this data comes from the ABS. In 1973, the nominal price of half a kilogram of butter was 63 cents. By 2023, 50 years, that increased to $5.40. So in that sense, butter got 757% more expensive. And very often, if you open a newspaper, certainly in the United States, though I hope not so often here in Australia, you will get somebody complaining about prices have never been this high. Well, yes, in nominal terms, prices have never been this high. But we all know that we need to adjust for inflation. So 63 Aussie cents in 73 is equivalent to $7 today. But we know that butter only costs $5.40. Therefore, we can say that butter actually got 23% cheaper. Okay? One last step, we'll look at the time price. So once again, price of butter in 73 was 63 cents. The hourly wage of an electrician was $3.05. So our tradee would have to work 12 minutes in order to buy half a kilogram of butter. By 2023, price of butter goes up to $5.40, but electrician now earns almost $60, and that means that he now only has to work 5 minutes in order to buy half a kilogram of butter, which means that butter actually got 56% cheaper instead of half a kilogram of butter. Now our tradee for an hour of work can get 1.14 kilogram of butter, butter became 126% more abundant. Okay? Why do we use time prices? Well, because if you want to convince people that whether things are getting more or less abundant, you better look at as long a period of time as possible. 1 billion people in 1800, 8 billion people today. So in our book, we go back to 1850. That's as far back as we could. Now, how do you calculate prices for that period of time? Because some of the currencies are gone. They are no longer used. The Austro-Hungarian thaler is no longer available. And we have no idea what happened to inflation in between. Now, the beauty of time prices is that it doesn't really matter. An hour of work today in the United States is the same as in Australia or in China. And an hour of work today is the same as it was in, say, 1926 or even 1826. So that's the reason for time prices. And the beauty of it also is that the additional beauty of it is that it doesn't matter what happens to inflation. Whether inflation is 1% or 1 billion%, it doesn't matter. You're always comparing nominal price, the price in the shop, with nominal wage, the wage at the time of the purchase, at the beginning of your analysis, in our case 1850, and you compare nominal price and nominal wages in 2023 or 2026. So what happens to inflation is actually irrelevant. So remember that goods and services can get more expensive in nominal and real terms, but they can become more affordable at the same time. What matters is that wages, that's the line in blue, grow at a faster pace than inflation, which is the line in yellow. As long as wages rise at a faster rate, as you can see in this Australian example, then the effects on abundance can be quite dramatic. Here is an example of growing abundance for blue-collar workers, such as electricians in Australia over the last 50 years. Airfare from Melbourne to Sydney increases in abundance of roughly 300%. So now you can get 3 tickets for the price of 1. Eggs have become 173% more abundant, so now you can get almost twice as many eggs as you did before. We have other food items, bacon, flour, rice, butter, etc., becoming more abundant. What hasn't become more abundant in Australia is fuel. Loaf of bread, that's kind of a misnomer there, because bread, apparently in 1973 in Australia, used to be delivered to your door. So maybe that's, and of course cigarettes have become much less abundant, and I assume that the Australian government had something to do with that. Here is a longer time perspective over the last 100 years compared to average wages, and then you can see abundance of things like train trip or bicycles or beer or umbrellas or women's shoes or men's shoes. Even bottle of whiskey is now almost 200% more abundant. So there are many different ways in which you can see that abundance in Australia has increased. I now want to show you what happened in New South Wales over the last 110 years. So again, by the way, before I get accused of cherry picking, sometimes our analysis begins in 1997, sometimes it begins in 1973, sometimes it begins in 1915. Whenever we can get the data, that's when we start, right? We don't go in search of things that prove our point. Basically, we ask the ABS, okay, do you have any data set that we could use? They give us something, and this particular one starts in 1915. And what's so interesting is that in the last 110 years or so, the abundance for women has increased at a much faster pace than for men. So wages for women have increased at a much faster click. So, for example, milk has become 2,500% more abundant from the perspective of female wages, but only 1,200% more abundant from perspective of male wages. I'm not going to go through all of that. If anybody is interested, we can share these stats with you later, or you can just do a screenshot when this is posted online. But eggs, sugar, cheese, rice, ham, potatoes, jam, tea, everything has become basically much, much more abundant than it used to be. Now, unfortunately, not everything is getting more abundant. Sam Fox, who worked with me, he's an intern at CIS, created this wonderful chart for Australia between 1997 and 2025. And if you, so this is the overall inflation for Australia over that period of time. But as you can see, wages have increased at a faster pace than inflation. And you would expect that because people become more productive per hour of labor under normal circumstances. So wages are higher than inflation. So we know that we are in a good place, right? Australians are better off than they were in 1997. But they are not better off equally. We can see that food and alcoholic beverages are cheaper relative to wages. We know that transportation is getting more abundant, recreation, household furnishing, clothing, footwear, and communication. But that's not true for education, health, and housing. So now in the next slide, what we are going to do, we are going to index this chart, but relative to wages. And this is the picture that we get. As you can see, communications in the last 27 years or so have become almost 200% more abundant. Clothing and footwear much cheaper than it used to be. Household furnishing, recreation, transportation, even food and non-alcoholic beverages are more abundant than they used to be. That is not true for housing, health, and education. And I think that the key of this presentation, but also in terms of CIS's work into the future, is to try to explain to Australians why is it that certain things can be becoming abundant at a very high rate, but some things are not. And the argument that I would make is that these are highly competitive and highly traded commodities by and large. But there's a lot of competition, very little protectionism, very little subsidies, and so forth. Whereas what you are getting in the red area is a lot of government interference. So housing is obviously suffering both in Australia and in the United States and even in Britain from basically zoning regulations. We cannot build as much as we need to. We have an increasing population, even natural rate, not just immigration, but we are constrained as to what we can build. In the United States, and I'm sure the situation in Australia is very similar, you have a certain plot of land, you can maybe build only one family unit on it, whereas if you could build 2 or 3 or 4 family units, or maybe a small skyscraper or something like that, you could get much more out of that land and bring down the prices, but you're not allowed to because the government says you can only build a certain type of dwelling, right? So these could be examples there. And then there are ways in which you can deregulate that. You can do upzoning. In a paper which I just finished for CIS, I talk about the deregulation in Auckland, which happened in 2016, and in New Zealand, actually, rents in Auckland have frozen. Okay, so they are staying the same, but so they haven't fallen. The prices haven't fallen, but they stayed in place. But that means that as New Zealand wages have increased, but the prices remain the same, then the share of the New Zealand income or Auckland income that goes to housing is actually decreasing. The situation in education, I'm not a specialist, but if it's anywhere similar to the United States, in the United States we have a huge problem with basically subsidies. When universities know that there is this big of a pool of money, then they will charge a certain amount of certain type of fees, tuition fees. But if they know that the pot of money is this big, then they are going to increase the tuition fees in order to capture all the additional money which is available. In the United States, we call the Pell Grants, which can give students $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year in terms of loans. In Australia, you have, I believe, HELP grants. Once again, students don't shop necessarily for based on price. Somebody tells them, "Here you've got a bunch of money," and they will say, "Oh yeah, that looks good. I'm going to take that product." And so subsidies generally increase prices rather than decreasing them. And then when it comes to health, again, I'm not a specialist on Australia. In the United States, basically 9 out of every $10 spent in the healthcare sector is spent by third parties. So people no longer go around and shop for stuff. Somebody else pays for it. When I go and see my doctor for my annual physical, he tells me you need these 20 blood tests. I never ask him how much is it going to cost. It's irrelevant to me because a third party pays for it. My insurer pays for it, right? So we don't shop on price. There is no clarity of pricing when it comes to healthcare. And finally, there is an issue with a serious economic problem. It's called the Baumol effect, whereby even in industries or economic sectors which do not experience productivity gains, wages still go up in order to keep up with wages in productive sectors. Why would that be the case? Well, a typical example would be something like, I don't know, a masseur in the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago giving you a massage, and somebody giving you a massage today in Sydney. The massage is exactly the same, but the guy in Sydney is earning maybe $100 or $150 an hour, whereas the slave in ancient Rome was maybe earning, a couple of denarii. Why is that? Why do we pay masseurs so much, even though the massage remains the same? Is because if we didn't, there would be no masseurs, right? They would be doing something else. So even the unproductive person needs to be paid a lot of money, otherwise they wouldn't be doing the job in the first place. So we can talk about that in Q&A more if you'd like to. I now want to return very briefly to the book that we have written, and here is what we found for the period between 1980 and 2018. So this is a global perspective. I talked to you a lot about Australia. Now I want to turn to the world. This is the period of globalization. As you know, Americans are not very hot on globalization these days. But in this time period, we have basically added 4 billion people into the global economy, the Chinese, the Indians, and many others. The global economy has massively expanded. Those people became richer. So we would expect that resources have become less abundant, right? We have much more demand for resources. Whereas in fact, what happened was that in spite of population growing by billions of people and the economies expanding, the abundance of, or the time price of resources, this is a global perspective, fell by 72%. So now you get 52% increase in abundance. What about Australia? Australia did relatively well. It did above average. The abundance of resources in Australia, time price fell by 72%, by 74%. So abundance of resources in that time period between 1980 and 2018 has increased by 282%. So you did better than the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, France, if that matters. So remember this chart which so frightened Malthus. The reality looks more like this. It is resources which are increasing at a faster pace than population. And the difference in rate, that's the reason why resources can increase at a faster rate than population is because of new knowledge which is created in human mind. So in our model, we start with the overall population of the world. Only a small fraction of humanity invents or innovates anything. So the more people you have, the more likely it is that the absolute number of innovators is going to increase, such as Norman Borlaug, Nobel Prize winning agronomist from the United States, who came up with improved type of wheat, which means that the yields of wheat have increased from roughly 1.5 ton per acre in 1960 to almost 4.5 tons of wheat per acre by today. So the same acre of land can produce thrice as much wheat. Why? Because we have better wheat varieties, which took a man or a woman to come up with the idea of how to create that kind of new wheat, which then leads, of course, to the decrease in starvation, decrease in famines. But of course, population is not the only thing that matters. If it did, then China would have been the world's richest country for a very long period of time, whereas China until recently was a very poor country. So what matters really is population times freedom. It's only after the Chinese were given the freedom to invent and innovate and try something new that China has turned from a third world country into the second largest economy in the world. So the question then becomes, can superabundance continue? Not everybody thinks that. Here is Kenneth Boulding, an American environmentalist, who said, anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. And Kenneth Boulding is onto something. There really is only a finite number of atoms on Earth. But what I'm going to try to convince you of is that atoms are actually not all that important. This is a Lamborghini Huracan worth $250,000 for all the guys in the audience. This is a Lamborghini Huracan worth a few $100s. But of course, the number of atoms is exactly the same. They've just been arranged differently. The first one intelligently, and the second not intelligently, right? So what really matters, my point is that what really matters is human intelligence and the new knowledge, which then can help us to expand our resources into infinity. I'm now going to go very quickly through some of the ways in which we can expand our resources into infinity. The first one is obvious. When something grows in price, such as price of iron ore during the early decade, the first decade of this century here in Australia, people have an incentive to look for more, right? Because they are driven by the impulse to make profit. But we also have technological breakthroughs. In the United States, we basically ran out of oil and gas that we could produce with normal, ordinary drilling methods, and we became addicted to oil and gas from the Middle East. Now the United States is once again the world's chief producer of oil and gas. Why? Because new technology, fracking, which allows us to get an oil and gas which previously would have been uneconomical to get at. You can also increase efficiency. A can of Coke used to weigh about 3 ounces of aluminum. Now it's only half an ounce of aluminum. I like to sometimes say that in the old days, if you wanted to show how strong you were, maybe impress a girlfriend or so, you would try to squeeze a bottle of, a can of beer. And it was really hard because there was so much aluminum in it. Now even a child can do that because there is so little aluminum in it. Plastic bottles now contain 50% less plastic than they used to. Even glass bottles are about 25% thinner than they used to be. So that's a relative efficiency gain. But there is also absolute efficiency gain. So for the longest time in the United States, our consumption of resources and the economic growth would be going in parallel. The more economic growth you had, the more resources you would use. But about 15 years ago, what started happening is that actually the American economy continues to expand, but the total amount of resources, the tonnage of resources used by the American economy is actually decreasing. According to Ido Wernick, a researcher from the Rockefeller University, out of the 100 most used resources in the American economy, 41 are post-peak. In other words, the economy continues to expand, but they are now decreasing. Okay, so they are post-peak. And that includes cropland. We produce more food and more meat on fewer and fewer acres of land. We use less copper every year than we used before, less water, less iron, and so forth. We can increase value from something. So when we started melting sand, people would use sand to make little glass balls that they would then hang around their necks to beautify themselves. Later, we figured out that you can make glass and windows out of sand, and now we are using sand in fiber optic cables and in microchips. So with every step of the way, you are increasing the value that you derive from something as basic as sand. We can turn something which is useless into something that is useful. In the old days, if you were drilling for oil, a lot of natural gas would come up, so you would flare it. In fact, if you go to underdeveloped economies today, you can still see a little flame on top of an oil rig. They are flaring, they are burning natural gas because it's very dangerous to be around natural gas, especially if you're trying to light a cigarette. But in sophisticated economies, we capture that gas and then we pipe it into homes and we heat our homes with it. So something that was useless is useful. In fact, everything is useless if you don't have the knowledge to use it, right? How many Neanderthals and how many hominids died surrounded by wood and oxygen because they didn't know how to put it together in order to create fire? Okay, so it's the knowledge that matters. We have substitution. So we no longer kill whales in order to get their oil to read books. We now can use electricity or electricity derived from burning of oil or coal, etc. Instead of cutting down forests, as we did during the Industrial Revolution, we now use coal. So forests in the United States and in Britain, the early industrializers, are actually increasing rather than decreasing. Instead of guano, which is basically just bird poop, which we used for fertilizer, we now derive most of our fertilizer from natural gas. We turn it into ammonia and then we sprinkle it on our fields. Actually, I don't know if you sprinkle it or if you how you do it, but spray it. Maybe you spray it. But the bottom line is that 4 billion people out of 8 depend on synthetic fertilizer in order to live. Instead of animal furs, we use synthetics. And of course, substitution means that whenever you read something in the newspapers that we are going to run out of, doesn't mean that we are going to run out of it. Electric vehicles need a lot of lithium-ion batteries. So where are we going to get all the lithium? There isn't very much lithium. Well, we'll use sodium-ion batteries. In fact, they seem to be even better than lithium-ion. And there is more. Sodium is the 6th most abundant resource on Earth. Dematerialization. 20 years ago, if you went into an Aussie hotel, in order to get internet, you would have to plug it into a wall with a thick copper cable. Now all those cables are gone. All that copper is being used somewhere else. You get internet through Wi-Fi. It's been completely dematerialized. Doesn't use any material at all. The economic function that we are interested in. We don't care how we get to the internet, provided that we do. And so we don't care that we no longer use copper in that sense. Now we use nothing at all. The same goes for other types of dematerialization. You use Waze instead of paper maps. We use email instead of mail. And of course, there's the iPhone. Imagine all the atoms, the mountain of atoms that I would need if I were to make the use of all the gadgets which now are nothing but an app. Right? I no longer have a physical calculator, it's here. I don't have a microphone, it's here. I don't have, I still have a TV, but this can serve as a TV. It still does make phone calls, oddly enough. But it's also a flashlight. It's also a notepad. It's a camera. A lot of people just don't buy individual cameras. They basically use this thing. So once again, think about the different ways in which this thing has dematerialized what we are using in our lives. Very briefly, we can, of course, reuse metals and minerals. In the United States, when Americans were making the nuclear bomb that eventually got dropped into Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they didn't know how to enrich uranium. So the magnets for enriching uranium had to use silver. So the U.S. government gave the Manhattan Project 14,000 tons of silver. And then when eventually silver was no longer necessary for these magnets, other things replaced it, all that silver was then returned back to the US government. Transmutation, I like to point to my hero, Isaac Newton, that actually most of his life he didn't spend inventing calculus or coming up with the theory of gravity. He actually spent most of his life trying to convert base metals into what would you call it? Into expensive metals. So, but of course, humans already know how to do that. Through neutron bombardment in the early 1980s, we were able to convert atoms of lead into atoms of gold. So there's nothing preventing us from doing that except cheap energy. Because if we were to do it, an ounce of gold would cost quadrillions of dollars. But imagining a future where you have energy that is too cheap to meter, you could then convert any metal into any other metal. And of course, we already know how to make the most expensive mineral, which is diamond. We take a tiny bit of diamond, then we put it in a confined space. We superheat methane, which then becomes carbon vapor, which then deposits itself atom by atom on top of the original diamond until you get a big diamond, which is physically and chemically indistinguishable from the real thing, which is why the prices of natural diamonds are falling, and which is why 72% of men in the United States now give their fiancés synthetic diamonds, which of course are chemically and physically, as I said, indistinguishable. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we have to keep in mind that the Big Bang only created hydrogen, and everything else that was created in the universe was created inside of stars, under different pressures, under different temperatures. Gold and zinc and lead and everything else was created when those stars blew up. They went supernova. They seeded the universe with the materials which are found on Earth. But a star is just a fusion reactor. So between hydrogen, 73% of the world is covered in water, which is full of hydrogen. And between fusion, which we already know how to do, we can basically create anything out of hydrogen, because that's what the universe did. So with enough knowledge, we should be able to do that. If by some strange reason we still need something that we don't have on the planets, we have a convergence of 3 distinct technologies. We have robotics, well, actually 4 distinct technologies. You've got rocketry, robotics, energy, such as solar energy, and AI. Put together, you have basically armies of space miners whom we can send to the asteroid belt to mine for whatever we need. So, but that's a story of the next few thousand years, not necessarily something that we have to worry about now. So, in the words of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Romer, what is really needed is more knowledge, and more knowledge is unlimited. So atoms are limited, knowledge is unlimited, and consequently, we consistently fail to grasp how many new ideas remain to be discovered. The difficulty we have with creation of knowledge, we have the same with compounding. Possibilities do not add up, they multiply. Okay, so in summary, more people lead to more ideas, which lead to more innovations, which lead to more productivity gains, which lead to higher standards of living. Superabundance is really population times freedom. You need both. To keep population stable at the current level, we need between 2.1 and 2.2 children per woman per lifetime. Currently, we have about 2.2 per woman per lifetime. That's down from 5, which is what the total fertility rate was when Paul Ehrlich wrote his book in 1968. And by 2050, we'll be down to 1.83 with 95% confidence. So the world will start depopulating in 2064. Is that a problem? In our model, it is a problem. How do you fix it? You could try subsidies, but they don't work, as the Hungarians, Russians, and South Koreans have found out. They are extremely expensive, but they don't work. You could try to reduce the costs of childbearing and family starting by, for example, ending housing shortages. We can do that if the Greens allow us to do it. We could also try to end education subsidies. People spend far too much time in university, especially very smart women who then decide to go into postgraduate and doctoral studies. By the time they leave in their early 30s, the window of opportunity to have children. So, so basically the smartest women are taking themselves out of the gene pool. But that's not going to solve itself anyway, because that may make changes that may make improvements on the margins, but ultimately the opportunity costs of having children are still very high. It's not just the foregone income that a woman has to contend with; it's also all the fun that she could be having rather than having kids and spending time at home. Basically, the world is just so much more exciting. The trips to Bali are very cheap. There is so many different distractions, and so the opportunity cost is high. Actually, it appears right now from the latest data that the opportunity cost is actually increasing even in very poor countries. Even very poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you have people now having access to phones and YouTube and fun that they could never conceive of before. So life is just much more exciting, and so it's tough to say no to all that in order to have kids. We could be saved by humanoid robots. We could birth our children in artificial womb and then hand them over to robot nannies. People are already working on that. We could replace the human brain with artificial general intelligence. We'll see if we ever get there. The problem is that right now LLMs are excellent at summarizing literature, answering questions. But what we need is the type of intelligence that Isaac Newton had, which is to identify a problem on its own and then to try to solve it. AI doesn't know what it doesn't know. It knows what it has read, but it doesn't know that there's a problem that needs to be resolved, such as Isaac Newton was able to identify. In fact, if anything, we are trying to beat beat the surprise from AIs. We are trying to make them more predictable. When they started hallucinating, we really did a very good job of getting rid of that. But hallucination is really the only area in which the AIs were showing a little bit of personality. A cultural shift, we could change culture. That's difficult. In Israel, for example, Israel is the only Western rich democracy where birth rates are higher than replacement. But even there, it is mostly religious and ultra-religious Jews who have more children than 2.2 or 2.1. And so maybe the future of the world will be one where it's religious minorities who have 5 or 7 children who will have more kids and then who will populate the earth while the rest of us don't. So maybe the future will be like the anti-tech Amish in the United States who still ride horse buggies. So maybe that's the end of it. The other alternative is, of course, to have more people live in freedom. So the problem there is that freedom is actually shrinking around the world. Okay, so there are a lot of smart people in places which are not currently plugged into the global economy, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, North Korea, parts of Latin America. There must be geniuses there who could contribute to the growth of global knowledge, but they live in unfree societies where they are not able to let their brains function and contribute to human knowledge. The alternative is, of course, to bring them here. But immigration is unpopular, both in the United States, in Australia, and in other countries. But I would still like to make the case, maybe not for mass immigration, which I know is a political non-starter here as well as in the US, but I would make a call for high-skilled immigration. I think that that shouldn't change the demographics of Australia beyond what you are willing to accept, but bringing smart people here by thousands or tens of thousands really shouldn't have that much of an impact either on housing costs or Australian culture. So anyway, I don't have the answers, all the answers at least, but I think that population is important, and maybe we can take it up in Q&A. Thank you very much.
So if I can start with the idea of your relatively simple statistical treatment of superabundance, in which you take your time prices, how many hours of work it takes to produce something or other, and how that's falling over time. And I think the real advantage, would you agree with me on here, is that you get the falling time price of a thing. So for Australia, the resource time price over some period, as you had up there, had fallen 73%. But of course, something can only fall to zero. So it can only go to zero. But when you flip it and make it an abundance index as to how much more you produce, that can go to infinity in effect. So the abundance index for Australia was 282%. Just can you spell out how that works?
Right. So, So we didn't want to measure scarcity because scarcity is infinite. We'll always have scarcity of something. People always say, I could have the extra car or house or whatever. What we wanted to measure was abundance, how much better things are. And there's a conceptual problem here. There's a problem of perception here. As you said, time prices, or any prices for that matter, can only fall by 100%. And people sometimes, they sort of understand this. They understand that if something is 50% off, they're going to get 2. Okay, but if something is 75% off, they're going to get 4. And if something is 99% off, they're going to get 100. If something is 99.9% off, they are going to get 1,000 for the same amount of labor. And if something is minus 100% in time price, then it means it's free. And actually, in some of our data in Superabundance from 1850, what we found is that actually prices of commodities from 1850 to 2018, many of them have fallen by 99.9%.
So when you get to today, and some of the reaction we've got around the place is, Marian, how can you say that things are getting better? things clearly are getting worse, aren't they? And, we've had inflation and cost of living is going up. And so there's been a little bit of reaction to your work here. But I think one of the things you really pointed out there is where you saw on different sides of the ledger that where things are open to the market, we've had the increased abundance. Where things are subject to government regulation and increasing subsidies and so like, they're becoming more expensive and we can get less of them. So,
well, that's a secondary discovery. The important thing for us writing this book was to show that resources properly measured are getting cheaper. But then once you disaggregate different sectors of the economy, then you are beginning to see these relationships. Some things are becoming dirt cheap, some are becoming more expensive, and that leads then to asking questions. Why is this happening? What's so special about education and healthcare?
And then I was going to feed into CIS research, where done here by, as people would know, Peter Tulip has really showed that the housing shortage and the housing crisis is due by and large to a supply-side restrictions on planning and zoning, which restricts the ability of the market to produce more medium-density housing. And then we've had as well on the childcare area, where we have increased subsidies and more regulation. We've had CIS scholars Blaise Joseph, who I think's here, and Tricia Jar appear before a parliamentary committee on Monday, pointing out that more regulation and more subsidies of childcare and more regulation has just led to the price of childcare for people's pocket of going up, and so you've had that's become more expensive.
Sure. Here's an anecdote from the city where I live, Washington, D.C. So everybody knew 2 or 3 years ago that childcare was becoming almost completely unaffordable to ordinary people. So what did the government do? They passed a new legislation which says that you cannot take care of children unless you have a Bachelor of Arts degree, thereby increasing the cost even further. Because, it's, first it's social stupidity, but it's also rent-seeking. Yeah.
And I think there's another example in healthcare with cosmetic surgery.
Yeah. So, okay. That goes back to the Baumol effect. Very, very often people will say there's absolutely nothing you can do about healthcare because, nurses, even if they are not more productive than what nurses were during the Second World War or the First World War. I went to your war memorials in every city that I've been to, and I know that you commemorate your nurses from the 2 world wars. But today's nurse is not all that much more productive in terms of what the nurse was, say, 100 years ago, but she still needs to be paid a lot of money because if you don't, she's not going to do that job. Okay, so what we wanted to do was to see, okay, does this apply everywhere? And there is actually a market in the United States where you still have doctors, you still have hospital stays, you still have nursing staff, you still have anesthesiologists, but where you pay out of pocket, and that's cosmetic surgery. And of course, cosmetic surgery is dropping in terms of price like a stone. So whether it's breast implants or chin adjustment or liposuction or whatever else, again, these are medical procedures. They're actually becoming very, very expensive, very much cheaper relative to income. So Baumol effect is not the only thing that goes on here. It's also that people need to shop they need to shop based on price, and people don't do that when somebody else is paying. So
one is a regulated market with nurse to patient ratios and all this sort of thing, and the other is a deregulated market such as cosmetics.
That's correct.
Now we've taken what I've called a relatively simple statistical measure and started talking about that. Then I may perhaps go to some of the really big questions that you got in towards the end there. Why is it that superabundance is a phenomenon of the last 200 years in human history?
Well, so in my reading, what has happened is that there was an accumulation of small liberties that happens in Europe, especially Northwestern Europe, over the last 1,000 years, until it leads to a certain critical mass in England and in Holland in 16th and 17th centuries, where we can say that these are now liberal societies. right? By liberties, I mean small steps toward liberty. Magna Carta in the 1215, the Glorious Revolution in 1688, etc. But put together, these societies basically became ones where people were essentially free to do with their lives, with their bodies, with their ideas, almost anything they pleased. And that was historically unprecedented, and it is still missing in large parts of the world. And so once you have people who are living in freedom and are able to do whatever they please, then you get the sorts of the kind of economic takeoff that we had beginning in England and in the Netherlands roughly 300 years ago.
So it's the Enlightenment.
It's the Enlightenment. So Deirdre McCloskey, my colleague, would criticize me for it. She thinks it's liberalism. Yes. But to me, the Enlightenment, even humanism, brings something to the table. So when humanists, already beginning in 14th century, start talking about human dignity, equality under the law, that pushes the envelope further. Then you have your Enlightenment. You have the emphasis on reason and departure from myth and superstition. That again helps, but ultimately what you want is to get to a liberal society, which basically is a question of the last 200 years or so.
And this is really the battle that you're fighting, I think, with your Human Progress project. Now, we start off with where this really takes off with the Industrial Revolution based in Britain, and I referred to Max Hartwell, a former CIS scholar, who was an academic, I think, at the University of New South Wales. In the 1950s, he ended up going to Oxford, where he wrote, I think, circa 1956, The Rising Standard of Living in England, 1800 to 1850, which was a sensation because it claimed that the working class at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in England actually had a rising standard of living and weren't oppressed proletariat, as Marxist scholars of our time maintained. So from the start, there's the idea of a contest over whether the modern world, the Industrial Revolution and progress from there has actually been a good thing. Your work, as you said there, was inspired by the 1960s environmental backlash to modernism and industrial growth, the Club of Rome, Paul Ehrlich and so forth, and the famous bet between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich over whether commodity prices would rise over the next 10 years. But now there's other, but these are just a series of really almost cultural type challenges to modern liberalism that you're saying has produced human progress, and the sort of backlash you're getting today would be what sort of phenomenon that we see?
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand that liberalism, industrial revolution, capitalism, they have always been contested ideas from the start. There was always a portion of the population which didn't accept them. So the Industrial Revolution is opposed by the English aristocracy, the land-owning aristocracy, for example, and the Marxists. So the Marxists come a little bit later, and they and basically what you are talking about, 1800 to 1840, 1850, is the so-called Engels pause. The argument there being made by Marxists that wages have not risen in England in the first in the 50 years in the first half of the 19th century. Now, forests have been destroyed in order to get paper to write. There are countless books on the Engels Engels pause, and it is still contested to this day. What we do know is that by the time that Marx dies in 1883, it is obvious that his theory, which is immiseration of the working class, is wrong. Not only are the working classes not stagnating, but Marx was predicting that the working classes would become poorer. Why? Because he believed that capitalist competition between companies would shrink profits to such a level that the only way that capitalists could get money is to decrease workers' wages. By the time that Marx dies in 1883, it is obvious that working classes in England are much richer than what they were. And so now Marxists have to pivot. And this is where Lenin comes into it, which is why Marxism was known behind the Iron Curtain as Marxism-Leninism. What Lenin brings to the table is to say it is not the case that working classes are becoming poorer in England because they are exploiting brown people in Africa and Asia. In other words, it's the super profits made in those regions through colonialism that make the working classes richer. Okay, and so that has another 100 years of follow-up, where we are talking about the legacy of colonialism in the United States, here in Australia, and so forth. Now, the obvious counter-arguments to that are things like, let's look at the biggest colonial empires the world had ever seen, the Portuguese and the Spanish. Actually, Portugal and Spain ended up, whilst even though they had the biggest empires, they actually ended up being the poorest parts of Europe. How did that happen? Well, partly in the Spanish case, it's the institutional underdevelopment and the Dutch disease. So in the Spanish case, unlike the King of England, who always has to go to Parliament in order to get money, and therefore has to compromise with Parliament, eventually leading to a constitutional monarchy, in Spain, the king has access to free money from the Potosi mines in Latin America, and so that means that Spain never develops liberal monarchy. The second thing that happens is that you have Dutch disease. There is so much gold flowing from South America that it leads to hyperinflation in Spain. Everything becomes too expensive to make domestically, and so they import everything from the rest of the world, and that means that their domestic economy collapses. And so then you have a discussion about colonialism that lasts about 100 years. And eventually the latest pivot that the Marxists have made is toward environmentalism, where basically they are saying that capitalism and liberalism and whatever are going to kill us all. And my little bit of work has to do with pushing back against that notion. So that's a very long answer to it, but it's a big question.
So now we have, pushing climate change, the anti-colonialism that's still going on, the criticism of basically they're trying to really criticise the legacy of British colonialism, whereas the British culture and the rule of law, parliamentary democracy has been one of the great gifts to human progress.
I agree.
Glad we've got that established.
But the beauty of it all is that through looking at decolonization and also attacking capitalism because it's supposed environmental destruction, we can talk about that, is that it delegitimizes our societies. It delegitimizes both the economic and the political model upon which our societies are built. And that's the great danger there.
So I think in the Australian debate, people would have heard a bit about the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Thompson in the US, which has really been jumped on perhaps by the right wing of the Democratic Party in the US. What's the difference between abundance and your concept of superabundance?
Well, first and most important, our book came out first. But the fundamental difference is that Ezra Klein and Thompson, they identify certain areas of the American economy which are not becoming abundant, such as housing and transportation, at least in their view. Actually, transportation is becoming cheaper, but in their view, they want more trains. Well, whatever. The point is, they identify certain areas in the American economy where they want more abundance. We don't identify parts of the American economy or global economy that we want the whole economy to become more abundant. What we want to do is to create rules, business, pro-business regulations, taxation rules, property rights, that will allow anybody with a good idea to rise to the top and create value for the rest of humanity. What abundance does is to identify certain places, certain parts of the economy, such as housing, and say we should do more, and we should both encourage the private sector and also the government to do more in this particular area. And they managed to have a 200-page book without ever mentioning the word deregulation, because that would discredit them in front of the Democratic Party. Nonetheless, I'm still a fan of the work they are doing, because they are moving the ball, at least within the Democratic Party, toward greater towards supply side change. But of course, they cannot use those words, because if they did, they'd be completely dismissed as lackeys of capitalist dogs and whatever. So. But the fundamental problem is that Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, they are fundamentally at the root of it. They are still technocrats. They think if you pull on this lever or push that button, you get more of that, which is a good thing, and less of that, which is a bad thing. I don't think that's certainly not where we are. Partly because when you empower the government to do good things, you're also empowering it to do a lot of bad things.
Okay, I've got quite a few questions that I'd like to ask, but I better go to the floor. And I might call on Blaise Joseph, our new head of research program, for the first question.
Thank you, Marian. Fascinating presentation. So I've learned a lot there.
Thank you.
Can you talk a bit about abundance in the area of education, which is obviously much harder to measure? One school of thought is that literacy rates have improved all around the world and we've never been more educated. Another school of thought is that everything everybody reads now is very superficial. We've never been more stupid in one sense. Where do you stand on that? Do you think overall humanity is becoming more educated?
So first and foremost, I think that you and I can agree that the world is much more literate than it used to be. In sub-Saharan Africa, I think 70% of people now can read, and so forth. The question is whether we are wiser, or whether the stuff that we read. So again, Derek Thompson had this article about young people not reading books anymore, and that spread like wildfire throughout the United States a couple of months ago. But since then, those statistics have been challenged. They've been challenged for a number of reasons. One is that the United States still produces more books every year than the year before. Right now in the United States, we are publishing 2.6 million new titles of books every year. And if you believe in supply and demand, which I think you should, we all should, then presumably these books are printed because somebody is buying them. Now, it could be the case that people older than Gen Z are buying books and reading them, and that Gen Z have now not stopped reading books, but they're reading fewer books and maybe reading shorter pieces. That's possible, but I think that the jury is still out. Sometimes it is not necessary to read a long book back to back. Maybe you can get ChatGPT to give you a summary, but there are some books that should be read back to back. Are we wiser? I would probably make the argument is we are exposed to much more stupidity than we used to, right? Because in the old days, if you had a crazy person talking about, lizard people eating babies, or some other conspiracy theories, these people had no outlet for their craziness. They would never make it onto the pages of The Australian, right? One hopes. Whereas now, anybody with a crazy idea has basically unlimited ability to spread his or her stupidities, and that can make us feel as though we are becoming dumber. Whereas in fact, maybe it was always the case that only a small fraction of humanity was well educated and wise. Stupid people were always there. It's just that before it was easier to ignore them.
Jim Cox.
Thank you, Marian, for your interesting talk. Look, I probably accept if you look at a long period, say 30 years, we've made progress and we're better off. Maybe not so rapidly in the last few years, but that's a different story. But you didn't say a lot about climate change. And that's probably the main argument as to why increasing prosperity may not continue into the future. Not so much we're using raw materials, but we're destroying ecosystems such as the atmosphere and the water on which our life depends. So what do you think about all of that?
So when I started thinking about resources, when I started thinking about the effect of extreme environmentalists, I want to make a clear distinction between environmentalists, I include myself amongst them, who believe that we should have a clean we should protect the environment and at the same time protect the well-being of human beings and flourishing of human beings, and extreme environmentalists who believe in degrowth, for example. So when I first started thinking about the environmentalist opposition to economic growth, to capitalism and so forth, I could go in two different directions. I could do climate change or I could do resources. I chose resources because I believe that if you want to talk about climate change with wisdom, you should have a PhD in chemistry and physics, and I don't, and I wasn't going to. And so that's specifically what I left on the side. And I'm not going to go into details because there are people who are much better qualified in doing so. All I would say is that thankfully we are beyond having a conversation about how we are going to reduce energy consumption. That was a conversation that was had all the way up to February 2022 when Putin invaded Ukraine. Prices of oil and gas shot through the roof, and suddenly the environmental consensus collapsed. And now we are having a much more reasoned conversation about the role of nuclear, for example, the role of fracking, and the role of technological change in bringing about clean energy, abundant, reliable, clean energy that will both protect the planet and also that will allow for human flourishing. The direst environmental scenarios, climate change scenarios, are no longer credible and are not used by serious people. This is the IPCC 8.5 scenario, which was supposed to result in between 4 and 5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature by 2100. Nobody's using that anymore, partly because people looked at the small print and realized that the future these people were envisaging was a future whereby all of our energy in 2100 was going to come from coal. That's clearly not the case. We are going to have many different sources of energy. And so now it seems that global temperature will rise about 2.5 degrees, and that's manageable. It's about half of what we were worried about. So we are on the right track. We should be pushing for much more nuclear energy. Fusion doesn't produce any CO2 into the atmosphere, but provides us with the energy that we need. So that would be, it's a massive subject, but that's my initial answer.
I'd like to ask a question on the demand side of the equation. We've been talking about the demand is, well, actually on the supply side, because we've been talking about demand being very much more easily satisfied, so we can have twice as much of something that we used to for the same number of hours worked. I'm thinking of the supply side, and that is how much, from your graph, you're showing that certain things are obviously because of technical improvements, such as communications, and certain things have no technical improvements, such as education, as we've noticed. Now, how much are our local statistics affected by the fact that we're no longer manufacturing things? How much of it is because we've got extra things that are more cheaply per hour work, simply because we don't make them, but we import them, and they're cheaper to import? And how much of that perhaps has an impact because we're now borrowing more money? Right.
So I don't know if I can give you a full answer on the first question. In terms of value added, American economy produces more manufacturing than ever before. Planes, just to give one example. But in terms of dollar amount, the American manufacturing has never been better. It's just that we do it with many fewer people. Right, and that's what you want. That's how you get abundance, is to embrace robotics and productivity gains. I will try to answer your second question. It does worry me deeply that our government takes in roughly $4 or $5 trillion in taxes, but we are spending between $7 and $8 trillion. And so I would say that. Well, let's see. Abundance is nominal. It's nominal wages, right? That doesn't necessarily have to do much with government borrowing. That's just productivity of the American worker. The fact that the government spends much more than it can get in taxes, it is a serious problem. But I don't think offhand that it is directly connected to the discussion of superabundance. I could be wrong, but let me think about it some more.
I was just relating to your graphs and the cost of living, which was, of course, based on wages, and the assumption that if you're on wages and you have a really good union that puts in inflation, that automatically keeps pace. Unfortunately, I'm an ex-employer. 20-odd years ago, I retired. I'm a self-funded retiree. And unfortunately, the pool of money I had from 20 years ago doesn't automatically, every time inflation goes up by whatever the percentage is, it goes up. So there are people, certainly outside the public service, where we are affected by it. I look now at some of the costs compared with 20 years ago, and even looking at it, and it is bloody expensive, you know. Yeah.
What happened? But I mean, presumably your money is invested in earning and growing.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
unless we run into recession or it hits the fan, and there's no guarantee.
No, there's no.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, so
the human progress is not guaranteed.
I wouldn't mind if it automatically was tied in with inflation. That'd be great, but it's not. You know.
So I cannot pretend to be a specialist on Australia. What I do know that in the United States we have an inflation of roughly 2.7%, and I have cash invested in a bank which gives me 4% interest on that cash. So every month I'm getting ahead in terms of just the cash position which I have, which is quite separate from my that's just money that I need. So. I just don't see why any person with should be sitting on a pile of money that shrinks every year due to inflation without investing in with minimum risk.
Bank interest is highly taxed as well, so you probably want to put it in the share market.
Hi, great talk, thank you. So I have alarm bells started ringing when you were saying that the young women or the women who are highly educated are not going to continue to produce and have children. I've got a 25-year-old daughter who is highly educated, and just thinking, so you were saying that there was a religion that was, you were joking about it, that was going to increase the population because that's where the population is still growing. Is there kind of a new spirituality or a global mindfulness or something that you think might, I just wanted your take on what is going to encourage this generation of educated women to continue to have children when there's so many shiny objects and so much that they can do in their life now, including Bali.
Well, just so that I'm not misunderstood, whether your daughter has children or not, that's completely up to her. What I'm saying is that we are subsidizing education. There is overconsumption of education. We know there is an overconsumption of education because we are subsidizing. It's just a logical necessity. And that means that many of these women are leaving university with a very short window in which to have children, right? So our society is making the demographics. If you agree with me that it's a problem, demography is a problem, then our government is making it worse to stupid policies. That's what I'm saying, right? How is this going to be changed? It appears that the only again, here's a lesson from Israel: is that it's in places where women see other women with children pushing prams and things like that gives them that inspires them to have children. In other words, it's something cultural. It surrounds them, right? But how do you create it in a cultural setting where these things are not happening already? How do you recreate that? That's the difficult part. And I don't know the answer to it. By the way, nobody else does. So all I'm saying is that let's try to make a difference on the edges. Let's try to slow down the process of population shrinkage. In South Korea, it's 0.7 per woman now, right? 0.65. So, I mean, eventually the North Koreans don't even have to have a war. They just walk across the border and find a depopulated country. But we can make a difference on the margins, such as, for example, making it easier for people to buy a home and to start a family if they wish to. But beyond that, I don't know. Nobody else does.
At the John Anderson's Aspire conference this week, this issue was a live issue.
But beyond that, I don't know. Nobody else does.
At the John Anderson's Aspire conference this week, this issue was a live issue. And one of the suggestions was that because of the spread of higher education, particularly amongst women,
you're right that young people wouldn't be in the Australian or Michael's All paper, the AFR. That's what we have the Sydney Morning Herald and Guardian
finishing their university and going into education.
My question for you is,
they can't get in the housing market.
What is it about the human psyche that the spirit of
20, 30 years
Malthus
ago, they would have been working for 15 years and would have saved up a deposit.
Ehrlich has been wrong for 50 years, but he's still out there talking.
Is there some way we can make it easier
He's now
for
onto
women to
climate,
have the
as you've
children
noted.
younger?
And
living
while
longer
you say
as well,
that
so they can
freedom
get sort of that
is
done
important,
and have a system in which they
people
can
are also free to
then
vote
still
for
develop
poverty.
a professional.
And a lot of the government policies you're describing are actually voted for by the people.
Perhaps
what is it about the human psyche that is perpetuating this?
Early on, and have childcare arrangements which are more flexible than what we've got now, and ways to help that process.
The essence here is, I think that one of the most stable aspects of human psyche that we have evolved for is zero-sum thinking. If you think of us as separating from the baboons and chimpanzees and whatever else, that was about 7 million years, right? So the hominids are around for about 7 million years. That's a very long time in which we have acquired certain psychological traits. One of them is zero-sum thinking. And what's zero-sum thinking? If you look at a baboon band today or a chimpanzee band, in order to increase their wealth, what they do is that the males invade the area controlled by the other chimpanzee group. They slaughter all the males. They take all the females, and then they have more trees with fruits on them to live off. Okay, so this is how we have increased our wealth for the last 7 million years, basically by slaughtering the enemy and taking their stuff. Okay, and it's very different. It's a very different mentality from thinking that you can actually create stuff out of nihilo. Ex nihilo, that you can actually create stuff and become filthy rich by creating a starship or Amazon, right? That's simply not part of our mental setup. Another thing which I think is important, and that's I wrote about it in Quillette, an excellent Australian product, is that we have, of course, always evolved for social solutions rather than technological solutions. So a social solution to a problem such as scarcity would be to say, Michael, you need to drink less water, you need to eat less food, because otherwise we are all going to starve to death. So that's a social solution, whereas obviously the key to human flourishing is technological solutions, such as finding a way to raise more chickens or more wheat on an acre of land. But because for the first 7 million years, technological solutions were very infrequent. After all, the first technology we chance upon is stone tools 2.5 million years ago. So the technological solutions were simply not there. So they have not been internalized in our mentality. Whenever there is a problem, we first reach to a social solution. Don't drink, don't eat, etc., etc. Did that make sense?
Thank you. I agree with everything you said, and I'm an engineer. Are you getting a strong embrace from the economists?
Well, the book was reviewed very positively in The Economist, so that was a good start. No, The Economist, look, The Economist, we didn't win The Economist. The Economists were won in probably 1990 as a result of the wager between Simon and Ehrlich. Do I have time to talk about it? Briefly. Oh, gosh. Julian Simon, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, challenged Paul Ehrlich to a bet. Ehrlich would pick 5 commodities. If they increased in price between 1980 and 1990, Ehrlich would win. If they decreased in price, Simon would win. They decreased in price, adjusted for inflation, by 34%, so Ehrlich actually had to pay Simon. And ever since then, this debate has been settled amongst the economists. But the public continues to be befuddled by zero-sum thinking and overpopulation concerns.
And if you'd had that bet sort of in a straight
relationship between Simon and Ehrlich. Do I have time to talk about it?
Just briefly.
Briefly. Oh, God.
Through that.
Yeah, and in the short run, you can have spikes in resource prices, which is why you need a book such as ours that goes back to 1850 and finds that relative to wages they have fallen by 99%, because it goes like this. But the trend relative to labor is just one way, and that's down.
And if you'd had that bet sort of in Australia in 2000. About commodities, you would have got stumped by the
Thank you, Michael, and thanks, Marian. My initial question was actually asked 2 questions ago, but I'm going to cheat and ask a variant of it. So not the why are we so attracted, or why are some people so attracted to zero sum thinking, but perhaps a related question.
We're selling it.
Which is this:
we're selling it to the Chinese. They have to pay more.
It's very noticeable.
But their productivity enabled them to produce much cheaper manufactured products, which the Americans bought,
that they are attracted to simple narratives if we do the following thing, usually a regulatory thing, but sometimes a methodological change, such as adopting non-evidence-based teaching methods, it will achieve such and such an outcome. And they don't have a very good record of the thing achieving the outcome.
Okay, look, we're
the thing that really delivers prosperity is highly distributed decision-making across lots and lots of different brains connected by some form of communication, such as market signals. Why do you think it is that the people who call themselves intellectuals, let's say, are so much attracted to really simple narratives which don't deliver, rather than embracing what at the end of the day is a more complex narrative which has been shown to deliver for a long time?
Yeah, I don't think that progressives are immune to simple narratives. And I like the way that you use progressive, because in the United States, unfortunately, Americans always have to be special, so we call our progressives liberals, which really annoys me because I'm a liberal and I'm definitely not a progressive, even though I run Human Progress. So it's all very complicated. Nonetheless, there's plenty of simple narrative going on the MAGA right and so forth. But look, if your ideology comes first, then you are capable of allowing all sorts of things to go on and not worrying about results. A similar thing that you can see on the left when it comes to, collectivism and Stalin, the way that New York Times would ignore the famines in Ukraine and in Russia for many decades, and that many millions of people had to die in order to create a better tomorrow, because, again, a socialist economy, a planned economy, was more important. That was the primary goal, not actually increasing agricultural produce and making people wealthy and happier. So, intellectuals, there's nobody more dangerous than an intellectual who is befuddled or who is crazed by an idea. And after all, I actually think that there's a passage in Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago which sums it perfectly. He says Iago stops at 2 or 3 murders. So he talks about Shakespeare's Iago, and he says Shakespeare's villains are unreal. They are two-dimensional. They are not really proper villains, because to them, when they wake up, they look in the mirror and say, I'm a villain. I have to do evil. But Iago managed to kill 2 or 3 people, right? But whereas to kill millions, you have to be convinced that you are doing good. And that's where Marxism comes in. That's where Nazism comes in. So it's the ideology that drives people to slaughter millions of people.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've started from some relatively small and simple statistical idea that Marian had, to some very mind-expanding sort of concepts and idea we've thrown around. I think the basic message is, for those of us who can, go forth and multiply, because we need more people on the planet. Can you please join me in thanking very much our speaker, Marian Tupy. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice, working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.